Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. Spent about 15 or 20 minutes just talking about the challenges of cyber warfare, so I probably won't touch much on the violent extremism piece. I say challenges of modern cyber warfare in quotes there because as I look at the challenges of modern cyber warfare, they look a lot like the challenges of cybersecurity that we had 30 years ago and over the last 30 years. So I'll highlight some of that. As Frederick said, I am an active duty Army officer. I've spent 25 years in the military at this point. I started off 4 years as an actually intelligence analyst and an Arabic linguist, and then I spent about 10 years as a communications officer, and then the last 10 years I've worked in cybersecurity and cyber warfare. Since I am an active duty officer, I have to start with the traditional disclaimer. The views tonight are mine. They don't represent the United States Army, the Department of Defense, or the Joint Staff. So what I would start with is we are our own worst enemy. And what I mean by that is we look at all these high-profile cyber attacks that we've had in recent years, and you can go all the way back 30 years. There's always a component of those that is a failure on the part of the victims. They don't take cybersecurity seriously, they don't have coordinated programs, they don't take the basic security precautions they need to. If you look at Sony, while they did use a 0-day to get into the organization, once they got into the organization, it's what I call an M&M defense. It has a hard candy outer shell and a nice soft chocolate inside that you can eat all day long. And that's what they did to them. And if you read some of the reports that came out on this, they would talk about the fact that you could go into Sony in the headquarters. They didn't have anybody escort you around. You could walk around freely. They would leave computers open with administrative privileges, no timeouts. So it was really not a hard target. And if you consider just a few years prior to that Sony PlayStation got hacked, and while Sony itself is a bunch of siloed companies under the banner of Sony, they didn't export that culture of security from Sony PlayStation when they improved the security there to deal with those hacks to the rest of their branches, and they paid a fairly significant price for it. And again, if you look at Target, same thing. While the external hack to get into the organization was not trivial, they hacked a third-party contractor and used that contractor's access to get into Target. Once they got inside the organization, they again found a very poor culture of security. And even some of the hacks that we've seen in the military and most of the hacks that we see out there these days, the initial vector tends to be spear phishing. And it's not like these spear phishing emails are incredibly complex. You'll get an email from someone that says, hey, the document you wanted to print is ready to be printed. Click on this link. And it's from a .edu and you're in a .mil environment. And so there's no reason why you should click on that link, and yet people do. And so when I say we are our own worst enemy, it's because we don't take these things seriously. We don't build this culture of the security culture in our organizations. And so we have to look at how to solve these problems. And here's a few ideas. So the chart at the top is, someone's traditional version of cybersecurity. Defense in depth, you see all these layers. But the important part I would point out to you that is that one little thing right in the middle that says mission critical assets. And one of the big mistakes that most organizations make is they don't know what their critical assets are. And if you don't know what your critical assets are, you can't defend them. And if you don't know where they are in your organization, you can't defend them. The issue with cybersecurity is often that the attacker has an asymmetric advantage. They can attack your network anywhere at their time and place of choosing, and they only have to find one vulnerability to get into your network, whereas you as a defender are trying to defend everything, and quite honestly, you probably can't. But what you probably can do is to identify your mission critical assets and focus your defenses on those. And you can't do that in the cybersecurity department. You have to do that with your business unit. In the Army, we call that our operations team, but the point is your security personnel have to work hand in hand with the people that actually understand the business and know the day-to-day operations and how it's running and what's important to running it. Another thing is you got to wash your hands. You got to employ basic cybersecurity hygiene. And this is not complicated. Complex passwords. Don't leave your passwords under your desk. Have actual access controls. Have a security of culture where people ask questions when they see something that doesn't make sense. There's all kinds of stats out there, and I won't quote exact numbers from anybody, but in the large majority of the events we've seen, basic cybersecurity hygiene would have prevented numerous attacks. They say most stats are made up on the spot, so I won't make them up here. But the majority of the attacks out there we see, basic cybersecurity hygiene, basic training of employees is one of the most effective mechanisms for preventing successful intrusions into networks. One of the other things that we see out there is inside the cybersecurity industry, offense is sexy. Everybody wants to be the attacker. Everybody wants to be the guy that breaks into systems. But defense is necessary. It is the day-to-day drudgery work that has to be done. And while there are lots of organizations out there that are thinking through issues like active defense, like being able to hack back against adversaries, if you can't defend your own network, it's not going to make a difference if you can attack someone else's network, because they're just going to still come in and own your network. And the thing about a lot of these organizations is, once the crown jewels are gone, once they steal your intellectual property, you can't take it back. They've got it. And so you've got to identify those critical assets and protect them in advance. And then the other thing I would point out is what we call lessons learned in the military. One of the things we do constantly is whenever we have an exercise, at the end of that exercise, we get the leaders together, we get the soldiers together, and we talk about what we did right and what we did wrong, and we try to take lessons learned away from each exercise we do. We aren't very good about that in cybersecurity. And part of the reason is one of the things that John alluded to earlier, which is information sharing. We're not very good at sharing information across the industry, because when you get hacked, if you share that information, your stock prices go down. Or you don't want to share the vulnerabilities out there. But we have to get better about sharing indicators across the industry. We have to be better about learning our history as well. So we've been doing this for 30 years now. And if you go back to one of my favorite case studies, Clifford Stoll's The Cuckoo's Egg, and you look at the lessons he learned in that early event in 1986, the same lessons apply today. Easy to guess passwords, known vulnerabilities in the system that were unpatched, default vendor passwords and user accounts on systems. These are all the same things we see today. And so we have to get better about learning these lessons as time goes forward. Another problem we have in this field is rhetoric and hyperbole and inaccurate language. Every time we have an attack out there, it's the worst attack in history. My gosh, the sky is falling. Sony apocalypse. Why Sony is the worst hack ever. Aramco, Saudi Aramco, the most devastating attack against a private corporation ever. Except, of course, that, if you actually look at the numbers that come out of it afterwards, let's say it took Saudi Aramco, they had 30,000 computers that were wiped. Let's say it took them, we'll go extreme, $500 million to replace all those computers and all that data. I don't think it did, but let's say it did. They have a $1.5 trillion operating budget daily. It wasn't particularly devastating to that company. But it was devastating in the news. And that's what we see constantly. We hear talk of cyber Pearl Harbors and digital 9/11s. But these aren't the events that we really need to focus on. And we have to stop calling everything an attack. Most of the things that we see out there aren't attack. They're malicious cyber activity. They're espionage. If a spy walks into a building and empties a file cabinet and walks out with it, we don't call that an attack. But if he does it in cyberspace, we call it an attack. It's not an attack. And so we have to get better about the language we use. We see things like cyber war. Personally, I don't think there is such thing as cyber war. There's cyber warfare. There's the use of cyber operations in combat or in military operations. But you're never going to see a war that is just cyber, just like we don't see just Navy wars or just air wars. We combine all those tools together when we fight in combat, and it's just another tool in our toolkit. But this is what we get portrayed to us out there, is the cyber attack is coming and it's going to destroy your organization. And it could. Probably not physically. It could destroy your organization because you could lose your intellectual property, which is the lifeblood of your organization. And we've seen companies go under in the United States because foreign powers came in, stole their intellectual property, beat them in the market, and beat them in the business environment. And so that is a distinct possibility. But had they focused on maybe protecting that intellectual property, they might not have been in that situation. And this is probably the more realistic outcome of what we tend to see, as a result of what's going on out there. We see negotiations and diplomacy happening. We see prosecution. And those are the logical ends to this. And we're seeing this as emerging norms around the world. We're not seeing devastating cyber attacks. We have, aberrations occasionally like Stuxnet or things out there, but the vast majority of what we see is low-level espionage, intrusions, web defacements, DDoS attacks. These aren't things they're not war. They're annoying. They can be painful, especially in terms of espionage, but they're not use of force. They're not something that you can turn around and fire missiles back on. So one of the other challenges we have right now is we have this new warfighting domain we call cyberspace. And one of the big struggles is just figuring out how to integrate this with all the other warfighting domains, air, sea, land, and space. And I kind of liken it back to the early days of flight. When we first started bringing airplanes into combat, we were flying biplanes over the battlefield and chucking grenades out the door. That's how they were used. And that's all they thought they would ever be used for. And we're kind of at that stage now. We haven't quite figured out the proper way to integrate this into our operations. But that's really where we're headed, and what's going to happen with it is it's got to be integrated just like the other battlefield functions. And so as we're integrating cyberspace and cyber operations into our warfighting operations, the end result is somewhere down the line you have a commander sitting around a room asking how we're going to take out a target. And around his table he's got all his functional areas, and an artillery guy says, well, we could drop a couple rounds on that, and an air guy says we could bring a plane over and shoot it, and the cyber guy sitting at the table says, hey, we can turn off the circuits to it. And the commander is given those options and can choose the option that best matches his operation. Right now it's not done that way. It's done more in isolation just because it's new, it's shiny, everybody wants a piece of it, and there's a lot of worry about the ramifications of what happens if it gets out of the box. But that's where we're heading. What's interesting in this domain is the prevalence of non-state actors. Some people say that when gunpowder was brought on the scene, it broke the monopoly that governments had on violence, because now anybody could pick up a gun and shoot back. What cyberspace has done is it's broken the tyranny of geography. And what I mean by that is anybody who wants to participate in a conflict now can do so in some way, shape, or form from anywhere in the world. If you go back to the Iraq War, when we were there, if Iraqis wanted to get involved in that conflict, they picked up a gun, they went out their door, and they started shooting at Americans. If Americans wanted to get involved in that conflict, unless they joined the military, there's very little they could do to get involved in it. Maybe they work as a contractor or a security contractor, but that's about it. Cyberspace kind of breaks that paradigm, because now if I'm sitting in Brazil and I don't like something that's going on in Europe, I can get on my computer and I can protest that in some way, shape, or form. I can hack into systems. And so that's kind of the difference that cyberspace has brought into conflict. You also see a lot of non-state actors grouping up out there in kind of almost formal structured organizations. And we especially see a lot of this in Asia. One of my favorite areas to look at this is India and Pakistan, where there are numerous cyber militias, if you will, that have formed. They're not sponsored by the government, they're not part of the government, they're not part of the military. They are really groups of what they would call cybersecurity professionals, according to their websites. But then you also come up with newspaper articles where the Indian cyber army or the Pakistan cyber army is hacking the opposite's government websites. We saw a case where the Pakistani cyber army hacked the equivalent of the Indian FBI. And it goes back and forth tit for tat. The cyber caliphate is another example. We see individuals like the Gesture out there. The Gesture started as an individual who was hacking violent extremist websites in his spare time. He's moved a little bit beyond that now and has occasional wars with Anonymous, but that's where he started. And so again, you see this ability for someone who's no longer in the military to stand up and start and continue prosecuting a war, if you will, against those that he doesn't like. In Estonia, they've done something interesting. In Estonia, they have a cyber militia that is actually, during times of war, does fall under the government, but outside of times of war, it's a volunteer initiative with no ties to the government. And so it's kind of an interesting model. Thank you for your time. And I will turn it over to the next speaker.